In this video, we'll see how we can use CSS to create different page layouts. When we browse the web, we see different websites with different layouts. For example, a common layout would be a header, a footer, a sidebar, and the main content. Canvas kind of uses this layout, minus the footer, but with an actual sidebar on the right. And then there are sites that use grid-like layout, like, for example, Ars Technica. So this is a tech news site that I often visit. And you can see their content follows a grid layout where each article takes up one cell in the grid, and then there's a featured article that takes up 2 cells. Kind of like this. And then, of course, there are many other layouts. Some websites like to have 2-column layouts like this. And then you'll see websites that looks like this, where they have a nice background picture and then just simply a login box with username and password fields. All these layouts and more can be created using CSS. Before CSS was widely adopted, people used to use HTML table to create layouts. These days, you should of course use CSS instead. There are many good reasons for this. By letting HTML to handle content structure and CSS to handle presentation, the code is more readable and maintainable. CSS is also more flexible and more powerful in creating different layouts, and browsers render CSS layouts faster than rendering tables. And on top of all that, CSS also has accessibility support that HTML tables don't. This is the example we are going to use. As I mentioned, this is a fairly common layout with a header, a footer, a side menu, and the main content. And we'll see how we can use CSS to create this. But before we do that, we must first understand the default page layout without any additional styling. This is often referred to as the normal flow of the elements. Basically, by default, the browser will arrange the elements from left to right and from top to bottom. If an element is a block element, it will take up the full width, and the next block element will be below it. If it's an inline element, it will take up only the width of its content, and it will stay in the same line if there's space left. If there's no space left in the same line, it will wrap around to the next line. Now, to create a layout that's different from the default, the single most important property is the float property. We can use float to float an element to either the left or the right inside the element that contains it. Float sounds simple, but it's actually a bit complicated. First, a floated block element no longer takes up the full width. It will only take up the space its content needs. And also very importantly, when you float an element, it's taken out of the normal flow, which means the elements below it will be moved up and overlap with the floated element. But although the elements will overlap, their content will not. All this may seem a bit confusing, so let's look at an example. This is how things look like before we float an element. We have 3 block elements. Let's say there are 3 div elements, and each contains content foo, lorem, and ipsum. In the normal flow, each block element will take up the full width of the page and sit on top of each other. Now suppose we float the full block to the left. The first thing you'll notice is that it no longer takes the full width. Now it only takes up the width needed by its content. And then you'll also notice that the two blocks below foo are moved up, because when we float an element, it's taken out of the normal flow. Notice that the Laurent block is overlapping with the foo block because it's moved up. Laurent block is a regular block element, so it's still taking up the foo width. So when it's moving up, it overlaps with foo. However, notice that although these two blocks are overlapping, their content is not. The content of Laurent block will wrap around the floated element, the foo block. Here's another way to show it. On the left, we have 3 blocks before floating, and after floating the yellow block to the left, this is what they will look like. Note that the blue block element is still rectangular, and is now overlapping with the yellow block, but the content of the blue block will wrap around the yellow block. So now, knowing what we know, let's see how we can use float to create the layout we want. This one. I already have a HTML page and a CSS file here. In this is what the HTML page looks like. I have 4 blocks here. I have a header block, which is a div. Sorry, this is a menu block. I have a header block, which is a div with ID header, and it's this one. And I have a menu block, which is a div with ID menu, and it's this one. And then I have a content block with some additional divs inside, which is this part. And then I have a footer block, which is a div with ID footer, which is here. I have some basic CSS in place for header, menu, footer, and content. I put a border around them so that we can easily see where they are. And notice that now they are all laying on top of each other. This is a normal flow of how browsers laying out block elements. And for header, I also have a text align center, same thing for footer, so I have the text centered. Notice that there's a little bit space around these blocks, and if you adjust the window size, those little space doesn't go away. And that's the default styling the browser applied to the page. And if we don't want that space, we can put margin 0 pixel for the body element, and it will remove the space there. Okay, so this is what we start with, and this is what we want to end up with. So knowing what we know, the first thing we probably would try is to float either menu or content. It seems like a floating menu makes more sense since it's a smaller block. So let's float menu to the left and see what happens. So I'm going to add here float left. If we refresh it, we can see that this indeed is what happens after we float it. And if you compare that to, for example, this one, they look quite similar. Now, menu is floated to the left, it's no longer taking up the full width, content is moved up, content is overlapping with menu, however, the actual content of the content block is wrapping around the menu. Now, with this, we are already kind of halfway there. So how do we move content to the right to avoid the menu completely? Well, there are different ways to do it. The simpler way is, of course, we can just set a margin on the content block, set in particular a left margin, so that the content block will avoid the menu. So one thing, for example, we could do is simply just set a margin left, and depending on the width of the menu, let's say maybe 10 em would be enough. Okay, 10 em may be a little bit too much. So how about 8 em? And so we are pretty much there. And the menu block doesn't look too good because the border is too close to the menu items. And for that, of course, we can adjust a little bit. We can add a little bit padding to the right. We can say padding right to maybe 1 em. And so that's already pretty much what we want. So this is one way of creating a layout like this. All we need to do is just float one element to the left and then adjust the rest, and it looks okay. So let's say that we are not satisfied with this, and we want to be fancier, and we want to flow 2 elements instead of 1 element. So instead of just floating menu to the left, let's say we also want to float content to the right. And then let's see what happens. So first I'm going to remove this margin left, and then I'm going to float this one to the right. So now this looks weird, right? If we try to float content to the right, somehow it actually got pushed down, and then somehow footer gets moved all the way up here, and this doesn't look good at all. This, interestingly enough, is often what happens when you deal with CSS, especially float. So just by setting one property, you can go from something that looks decent to something that looks completely messed up. And you just need to know what happened, right? So we know what happened with the footer. Since now we are floating 2 elements, both elements are moved out of the normal flow. So the footer gets moved all the way up here, right below header. So that we understand. Now, it's not quite clear why content gets moved down instead of moved right. And for that, it's actually because this content block needs to take up the full width because of the content of it. So it cannot be simply placed side by side with this block because it needs more width. So that's why when the browser tries to lay them out, it will move it down to below the menu instead of side by side because this block needs a full width. Now, we could instead set a width for this block so that it doesn't need the full width. So, for example, we can simply say this one has a width of, let's say, 80%. And now you can see that it goes to the right and at the same level as the menu, because now we are telling the browser that this block doesn't need the full width, it's only need 80%. But our footer is still up here, and we need to move the footer down. And this is the second property that we need to use. And this property is often used together with the float property. It's the clear property. The clear property decides if an element can be next to floating elements before it, or it must be moved down below the floating elements. Clear left means no floating elements on the left. Clear right means no floating elements on the right. And clear both, of course, means no floating points on either side. Now here, of course, we don't want floating elements on either side of our footer, so we'll set a clear both on the footer. And now, once again, it looks pretty okay. So this is what our page looks like, and of course you can adjust additional properties. You can increase, for example, the padding of the content block. You can set the width of the menu block. For example, if the content takes up 80%, maybe the menu can take up 15%, maybe, and so on and so forth. So those things we already know how to do. It's just adjusting padding, margin, set width, height, and so on. So we already know how to do that. Now, we can stop here, but occasionally we want to be a little bit more fancy and maybe want to have something more than just this, like a sticky header or footer, meaning that if we scroll the page, our header and footer will stick to the screen without scrolling. So let me make the make the fonts larger so it's easy to show scrolling. Yeah, something like this. Okay, so let's say I want to have a sticky header. So when I scroll the page, the header will stay on top instead of getting scrolled out of the screen. To do that, we'll need the positional properties. The position property controls how a browser positions an element. The possible values are static, relative, absolute, and fixed. Now, these values are not exactly self-explanatory. For example, static, absolute, and fixed all sound pretty similar, and relative is actually not the only relative positioning. The rest are all also relative to certain things. But in any case, the default value is actually static. So throw out what exactly the English meaning of static. Here in CSS, positioning static simply means the element will be placed at its normal position, whatever normal position the browser decides. Now, if you want to adjust the position of an element a little bit, you can use relative to move it a little bit up or a little bit down or to the left or to the right, relative to the normal position. Now, if you want an element to stay where it is when you scroll a page, you need to use either absolute or fixed. The difference is that absolute is with respect to the containing element, and fixed is with respect to the browser window. To have a header always stick to the top of a browser window, we'll need to use fixed. Position property determines the way a browser positions an element, but you still need to tell the browser where the element is to be placed using properties like top, bottom, left, and right. And because positioning an element may cause it to overlap with other elements, you need to tell the browser which element should be displayed in front using the z-index property. Z-index value is an integer which can be positive or negative. The exact value is not important. The browser will simply compare z-index values and put the elements with the larger values in front. So knowing all this, let's go ahead and create our sticky header. So as I just mentioned, if I want it to be sticky to the top of the browser window, I need to use fixed. And I also need to tell where the position is, and I'm going to say it needs to be positioned on top and 0 pixel from the top. So if I refresh and then if I scroll, now notice that the header no longer scrolls with the rest of the page. But just like floating an element, the side effect of positioning an element is that now instead of taking the full width, it's only taking the width its content needs. And to fix that, we can simply add width 100% here so that it will still be 100%. Now we have two other problems. First is that, first of all, when a user looks at this page, they will see that the menu and the content are overlapping with the header. And that again is because the header is taken out of the normal flow and both menu and the content blocks are moved up. So to deal with that, the first thing we can do is we move header and content, move menu and content down a little bit by setting a top margin. So let's say this one will have a margin top of 5 EM. Okay, 5 EM seems to be pretty okay. And then we'll do the same thing for the content block. So the content is moved down, and now it looks fine. However, if we scroll it gets overlapped again, and that can be done by simply adding a background color to the header, so that when the content and menu are scrolled to the header, it will be blocked by the background color. So let's set a background color, and let's say background color will be white. And now it looks fine. And the good thing is that we don't even need to set z-index. Now, if the menu and content block somehow appear in front of the header, we'll need to set the z-index of the header so that it shows in front of both menu and content. But now we don't need to do that because, well, by default, it's already showing in front of them. Okay, so now we know how to create a decent looking page layout. Let's learn a little bit more about CSS layout. CSS layout operates in different modes. You can think of a layout mode as a set of layout rules. If an element is a block element, CSS will use the block layout mode, which is a set of rules for laying out block elements. This is arguably the most important mode when you create a page layout, because typically a page is divided into some blocks like header, footer, main content, and so on. Similarly, CSS use inline mode to lay out inline elements and table mode to lay out table elements like TRs and TDs. Position layout, as we just saw with the sticky header, can be used to put an element at a specific position. There are two additional layout modes: flexible box, also known as Flexbox, and the grid layout, which is still in its experimental stage. We've seen most of these layout modes. Now let's see two more examples. One for multi-columns in block elements, and another one for Flexbox layout. I want to say right away here that the multi-column properties here are for displaying text in multiple columns in one block element. They are not intended for creating multi-column page layouts that involve multiple blocks. Many students in the past had made the mistake of trying to use this to create a multi-column page layouts and found out that they couldn't set different widths to different columns and some other problems. So do not use this to create page layouts. They are just for displaying text in multiple columns. And what they look like is this. So I have a few paragraphs elements here, and right now they are all displayed in one singular paragraph, of course. We could, for example, select the paragraph elements, and then we could say something like column count to be 2. Now you can see that these paragraphs are displayed in 2 columns. Again, these are for displaying text in multiple columns, not intended to create page layouts. And you can say, for example, 3, and it will become 3 columns. There are a few additional properties you can adjust. For example, you can suggest a column width. It's just a suggested column width. A browser may ignore it. You can adjust the column gap, the space between the columns, and you can also set a column rule, which is kind of like setting a border. For example, we can say column rule is 1 pixel solid there, just like setting a border. And what it does is it basically draws some separation or borders between the columns. So multiple columns are part of the block layout, just like float. And now let's look at the Flexbox example. Flexbox is designed to be, flexible in the sense that it will automatically adjust the layout based on screen sizes, which make it rather useful these days since the visitor of your website may use all kinds of devices with all kinds of different screen sizes. With that said, in practice, you almost never use Flexbox to lay out a whole page. Usually, you will still use block layout with float, like we saw earlier, to create a page layout. And then maybe you'll use Flexbox inside a certain block. So today we'll see an example of how Flexbox works, but we won't get into much details. If you are interested, please check out the linked article, which has a lot more information on Flexbox. And this is our example. So let's first look at the HTML part, and then the CSS part. So this is what the web page looks like, and inside the page, you can see it's actually quite simple. I have 5 div elements, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And all of them are inside an element with the class container. And these blocks each has a class. I have a class big, 3 regular, and 1 small. So here I have a CSS rule that says any div inside the container. Remember, this is one of the combined selectors where you specify the ancestor and then select anything inside that or the descendants of this element. And for that means we're selecting all these divs under container. And for those divs, I set the background to yellow with a border, text align center, vertical align middle, and that's how they look like. And then I also set the width and height of those blocks. For regular ones, they are 200 by 200, big ones are 300 by 300, and small ones are 100 by 100. So I have 3 regular ones in the middle, and the big one as beginning, and a smaller one at the end. So this is why they look like that. And right now there's no additional styling, just some simple sliding for the blocks. So so the browser will lay them out using the block mode, meaning that one after another vertically. So to use Flex layout, the first thing we need to do is to say display flex, and that one needs to be placed inside the container element, basically meaning anything inside this element will be laid out using Flexbox mode. So let's do that. So container will use display flex. And then there are a number of Flexbox properties we can use, like the direction of the elements, how elements will be wrapped, how elements will be aligned, and so on and so forth. So let's set the direction first. And right now they are laid out vertically. So let's say I want a direction instead to be row. So if we refresh, we can see that now they are laid out vertically. And also, if we shrink this, you can see that it automatically shrinks the width of the box. And this is one of the reasons to create this Flexbox mode, because it tries to be flexible with respect to the screen sizes. If you have a smaller screen, it will shrink the size of the blocks. What if we don't want the blocks to shrink? What if we want them to wrap, for example, right? So we can say wrap them, and the value would be no wrap, which I guess is the default, but what if we say wrap? And this time, if we shrink it, now the box automatically wraps. And what if we don't want them to align on top? Maybe we want them to align in the middle. So let's try align items. And for align items, we will have baseline, center. I guess the first one is always the default. So let's try center. Okay, so now they are aligned in the middle. And Right now they are all next to each other, and I think we can space them out by using either align content or justify content. Actually, I'm not exactly remembering which one is which one, but let's try this one. Space evenly. Yeah, I think it's this one. Yes. So now they are spaced evenly, and again, Flexbox means flexible, and depending on the screen size, it tries to adjust the content in a smart and also flexible way based on your property settings. So this is an example of Flexbox. As I said, it's something that sometimes you would use inside a particular block element, but if you try to do this for a whole page, then you'll realize that it's just kind of difficult to do. So as I mentioned, if you are interested in learning more, check out the linked article here. Okay, so now we have the tools to create page layouts. Let's talk about the general strategy for creating a complex page layout. When you browse the web, you may see a website that has a fairly complex layout, maybe something like this. And you may be wondering how I can create something this complex. The answer is actually quite simple. HTML has a hierarchical structure, and this means you can create your layout in a hierarchical way. Note that in this example, you can first divide the page into a few big blocks, like the header, footer, left sidebar, and the main content, just like what we did before. And we know how to do that. And then once you have the top level layout, then within a big block, you can then create sub-layouts or sub-blocks by just repeating the same process. For example, to create a layout like this is what we could do. We could first create the top level layouts, header, footer, sidebar, main content, and then we can create two columns inside the content block. We know how to do this because although this look like two equal size columns, it's no different from creating two columns with different widths, right? If you know how to create a sidebar column plus a main content column, of course you'll know how to create two columns that have the same width. And then this gives us another level of layout within the content block, and then we can create further layout within each column, and just keep repeating this process, and you'll eventually get what you want, like this. There are two things I want to mention here. First, note that sometimes you need to create additional block elements, like this two, and most likely there are div elements. And these blocks are purely for the purpose of creating layouts. They don't really hold content themselves, but they are important for creating the layout. And second, if two block elements sit vertically, like this two, you don't really need to do anything special layout-wise, because the browser laid them out this way by default. This is the so-called normal flow. You just need to set margin, padding, border, etc. to make them look like what you want. However, if two blocks sit horizontally or side by side like this, that means you need to do float, either floating one of them or you float both of them. Okay, so this is the end of this video. See you in the next one.